Bob Weiner, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Clinton drug czar General Barry McCaffrey. He's also former chief of staff of the House Committee on Aging. Bob, good to have you back.
Alan, it's a pleasure. We actually have a huge development today in the Republicans coming in with an actual proposal on the fiscal cliff. So now you can match the proposals, and the Republican proposal isn't terrible. I think we will now be able to average the differences and come in with something that avoids the catastrophe.
Amy, to you, are you as sanguine as Bob is sounding? Because what I've been saying, and I had Congressman Rowe, I was saying perhaps what the Republicans should really do is more definitively say, okay, you have your tax cuts on the upper 2%, but only if you meet us with specific spending cuts now. Amy Ridenhour.
Well, it would definitely be nice to see our president take the lead on getting us out of the kind of fiscal trouble this country is in. He has said over and over again that he does believe that entitlement reforms are necessary, but he will never propose any. He seems to think that the more he spends, the better off we all are, but it's clearly not the case. I agree with you. If you're going to have that kind of a tax increase, which I'm not necessarily endorsing, but if you're going to do that, then you have to go down the road of making it worthwhile so we put the country in a nice fiscal footing. But the president not only doesn't appear to want to lead, he appears to want to go to Hawaii and make his Treasury Secretary do the job he was, well, I'll say paying for, but, you know, he ran awfully hard to have the job. Why is he making the Secretary of Treasury do it?
Because Hawaii's wonderful this time of year, isn't it, Bob? I'm not mystified. I mean,
Hawaii's lovely,
beautiful.
but Alan,
it
seems that what I just said just got thrown off the table and ignored. I just said this was a reasonable proposal by Republicans, and much to my chagrin, President Obama has said that he will support some entitlement reform, and the Republicans probably will accept some tax increases, and it looks to me like we are headed toward a deal. What did I miss in the conversation that just took place? That isn't what just happened today. The big news today...
No. Bob, Amy, Bob, give me a moment. Baby, Bob, I'm with you on this, Bubba. Work with me. I gave Amy a chance to say what she said,
yeah.
And she encapsulated her disappointment in the president thus far. But I was going to you. Wait a minute. I was going to you to have more elaboration. I wanted you to have fun with it,
yeah.
But I just kicked it off with a reference to Hawaii,
okay.
And you inferred that as somehow dodging it. I'm happy to see that something is there. But, you know, Bob, there's something else I want to talk to you about which I want to talk. And I was a little concerned about this. And part of it had to do with the administration demanding that the House relinquish its constitutional authority to control the debt ceiling. Now, this was submitted by Treasury Secretary Geithner and was received by guffaws from the GOP, especially Senate Minority Leader. Now, the reason it's so laughable is the idea that a president has any more authority to usurp a separated legislative power from Congress than Congress has to usurp the president's separated power to nominate a Supreme Court justice. Was the president and Secretary Geithner, Bob, in your estimation, just taking a humorous shot, or are they potentially this constitutionally illiterate? Bob Weiner.
I love your interpretation, but actually we're reaching an accommodation on this one too, Alan. This could be one of the more boring shows because there actually is a deal in the making. On the debt ceiling, what the president is getting at...
There's no deal. Wait. There's no deal in the making that Congress would ever relinquish its debt ceiling role. It's constitutionally required by Article 1, Section 1. Go ahead.
Having worked on the Hill for 16 years and in the White House for 6.5, what's going on beyond the posturing is President Obama is reflecting that there have been 30 years of debt ceilings raised with congressional approval. He's trying to send a message that quit putting the country and our financial ratings in the kind of abyss that they've been and letting the world and the stock markets and the financial companies think that we don't know what the heck we're doing. Let's have an understanding that we're going to continue to raise the debt ceiling as long as we reduce the debt the way that we're now going to agree to do. That's really what's going on, and I think we.
But that's a tertiary, Bob. You're already losing the argument. You're like a plane on fire out of the sky. That's a tertiary measure that you're using to supplant the primary one already provided to us by what the actual dispute in question, otherwise known as the rub. Amy, to you, this was very, very serious. What bothered me is how we have a press that was so incurious about it. Now, fine, maybe he was just taking a shot, but you know what? Not many years ago, Amy, journalists were required to pass some competency standards in coursework to demonstrate at least a functioning understanding of our founding documents' rudiments, if for no other reason than to preempt elected officials as well as the bureaucrats under them from being able to make false assertions about what the parameters of their powers actually are. Amy, has the dumbing down of the academia really dropped this far below the level of whale spit?
Well, I didn't know if it dropped or not, but it's been at the whale spit level as long as I can recall, and I'm 53, so that's quite a while. Now,
let's look at it. Article 1, Section 1 tells us all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Meanwhile, Secretary Geithner, with a straight face, said the president should be given this power. I mean, what would the president say if Congress knocked on his door and said, excuse me, Mr. President, I think from this point on, we would like to be the ones who nominate the next Supreme Court justice? Amy Ridenhour.
Well, what they would say is they would laugh. They would say it wasn't a serious proposal.
Thank you.
That's what the Republicans did say. No,
Thank you.
You can't do that. And also what Bob said a minute ago, that the problem we have trouble with credit ratings is because we have debt limit fights. The problem with our credit rating is that we keep borrowing money.
No, that isn't what
solve that is to stop.
That isn't what did it. What did it was the fact that we didn't say we would pay our debts regardless of what our deficit is. It wasn't the deficit that did it, Amy. It was the fact that we said as a country we were threatening not to pay our debts.
When we say we said, the president was making
the bipartisan deal
of false statements. We were always in a position to pay back that money.
That's right.
We would just have
but we didn't say we would.
Spending some of it domestically, but the president wanted to have a confrontation instead.
Oh, he only wanted to have the confrontation. That was a joint screw-up by both parties.
He's the only one who had the constitutional powers to decide whether we paid our debts back or whether we gave more money to, say, I don't know, a crony who runs a green energy firm.
Constitutionally, he had the power to pay the debt regardless of what the Congress did, but he allowed it to be a bipartisan deal.
He allowed people to think we weren't going to pay our debts, and our credit rating went to you-know-where.
Well, hold it. All this assumes that there are only two ends of a debt candle to be burned. You can either raise the debt ceiling to cover costs, or you can rapidly remove existing costs. And since the Government Accounting Office has already disclosed that our government misplaces over $350 billion a year through duplicated spending, the immediate cauterizing of that hemorrhaging provides more than a healthy bridge to get us on the path of solvency. Folks, stick with us. More with Bob and Amy. You are with Battle Line, Main Street Radio Network. Bob Weiner as well, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Clinton drug czar General Barry McCaffrey, fresh out of jail. We're all happy that he's completed his rehabilitation. We're so sad that his love life for too long has belonged to the guy with the most cigarettes, but he's back with us now. Bob Weiner, good to have you. How are you, pal?
My love life belongs to my delightful wife, whom you know.
Yes, I know. Listen, I always share this with everybody, for the Washington Post and others, but this is a letter that was, a statement, I should say, announced by Speaker Boehner. He said, essentially, in a letter sent to President Obama today, House Republican leaders made a new effort to avert the fiscal cliff centered around a middle ground approach first presented to Congress last year by President Clinton's former White House Chief of Staff, Erskine Bowles.
That's right.
The Bowles plan, presented in 2011 to the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, is consistent with the framework House Speaker John Boehner proposed the day after the election, a balanced approach of significant spending cuts and new revenues from tax reform with fewer loopholes and lower tax rates. This is another attempt to jumpstart substantive, good-faith negotiations toward a bipartisan solution that can be enacted soon, a stark contrast to the unserious proposal the White House put forward last week, such as that the executive office now has the right to grab the legislative powers of Congress. That little extra was yours truly and his addition. Bob, to you, or rather, Amy, to you. Where do you see this going? Because just because this is the counter pitch by John Boehner doesn't mean that the other side is necessarily going to play ball. Amy Ridenhour.
I agree with you. I mean, if the president were to come back and say, yes, we like it, presumably it would pass because Boehner presumably knows his caucus well enough. I don't know that we can say that the president's going to accept it. His first suggestion was so far impossible that if he suddenly is becoming rational, well, wonderful, but we have no particular reason to believe that. I can tell you one thing. The conservative movement, which is a lot of the members of Congress as well as a lot of tens of millions of other people, believes that the White House is playing to its Democratic and liberal base in this and is perfectly willing to go over the cliff. There have been numerous statements by heads of major labor unions, who, of course, are allies of the president, that it wouldn't be a bad thing if it were to happen. The way we see it, the president, if we go off the cliff, the president on the one hand says, okay, great, we just had a massive tax hike, and the president likes tax hikes, and we've just had a massive cut in the defense budget, which the president also likes. So it is entirely possible that the president's just setting this up to say we're going to go off the cliff. I'm going to be happy because I'm happier over there, and the Republicans are going to get blamed, so I'm going to be popular and I'm going to be happy.
Bob, do you see it happening that way?
No, sometime between the week of December 15th to 22nd, they will strike the deal, and the deal is going to accept some of Boehner's actually quite reasonable counter-proposal. Of course, it was myth to say Obama didn't have one. Now what they're going to do is average the two proposals, Obama's and Boehner's. They'll take some of the Boehner Social Security, much to my chagrin, some of Boehner's Social Security cost of living increases, some of the Medicare age increases, and Boehner will take some of the Obama tax increases, and Obama will take some of the Boehner loophole deductions, which were Romney's originated. This actually will be a blend of everybody.
Well, hold it, Bob. We have to admit one thing. It's got to be stated. It's got to be stated that it's not unreasonable to assert that the president's initial offer was a little weird and sort of.
Well, so is Boehner's non-offer.
Well,
but now they're back on track.
His offer has always been the same. He wanted to go ahead and adjust the tax code, get the $800 billion that way.
But he had no written proposal, and now you got one.
Well, they had
the Ryan budget, which, by the way, of course, the Bowles-Simpson committee found to be quite favorable.
No, they said it was a starting point. So
they said, and I quote, they said the budget released this morning by House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan is a serious, honest, straightforward approach to addressing our nation's enormous fiscal challenges. We applaud him for his work in putting forward a proposal which will reduce the country's deficit by approximately the same amount as the plan of the President's Fiscal Commission. So essentially right now the President is favorably looking upon that, which is very similar to what Paul Ryan put forward. Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it.
Very well that you're talking disingenuously by saying a concept.
Oh, really? I tell you what, you guys correct me where I'm mistaken here, because the irony here is that the President's initial proposal over the last few days, I think it came out last Thursday. Let's face it, the irony here is that this proposal of his was actually far more overreaching than was his 2013 budget that failed earlier this year in the Senate by a vote of 99 to zip. Not one Democrat supported it. As well as in the House by a vote of 414 to zip. So, Amy Ridenauer, to you, does this guy think his recent 2.5% popular vote margin victory, it was going to somehow turn, or rather was expected to turn these shutouts into 51 converts in the Senate and 218 in the House? Amy Ridenauer?
Possibly. I mean, it's either that or he simply wants to rally the left with the anticipation of spending the next 2 years, God help us, in a campaign mode so that he can get the House back and maybe make the Senate more on his side in the next midterm election. I can't tell you what the president is thinking, but I can tell you this. From where I sit, it looks like he's doing a lot more politics than he is governing.
I can tell you what he's thinking because I'm on
Bob.
strategy calls, and he's thinking that the election was a 60 to 70% victory for stopping the tax breaks for the rich. So he is going to use that capital of that, and the Republicans saw the same polling, and they also will agree to some of that as part of the proposal.
No, they don't tell you what the president is thinking in conference calls. They tell you the official spin on it.
Amy, I'm on the calls. Are you?
Bob, I'm not a moron.
I'm credentialed to go into the White House, and I go to the news conferences and to the meetings and the speeches.
They don't tell you what they secretly think.
The bottom line is he is looking at the polling of the tax breaks, and he has stated many times in speeches since that the tax breaks were even more popular than he was.
Do you guys think, I'm looking at the clock, do you guys think that perhaps one piece of leverage that the president really can't do anything about, because as much as he was demanding the debt ceiling privilege, he knows that it was bombastically imbecilic and brain dead to ever really expect that to happen. No branch has the right to usurp the separated powers of another. But, I mean, do you think that debt ceiling threat was still in the background, a bit like Damocles' sword? Amy Ridenauer.
Yes, because he wants to rally the left. He doesn't really care. Well, he would like to get it.
No, I mean, was he frightened of it? I mean, that's a very real check. It's a very absolute check. As a matter of fact, it is the most powerful check that the House of Representatives has on the government's potential overspending, regardless of who's in power, yes?
That and the fact that the House gets to appropriate bills to begin with, yes.
Bob Weiner.
I think, as I said, it was posturing, and it's sending the message that for 30 years we've had successful no fights over the debt ceiling, and now all of a sudden the Tea Party is creating them. So cut it out, guys.
Yeah, but that argument only works, Bob. That argument only works if we accept that your narrative has even the least infinitesimal correlative relevance to the facts it proposedly supports or explains. It doesn't.
Alan, in 2006, Barack Obama cruelly attacked George Bush for wanting to raise the debt ceiling. This whole thing that Bob is saying of how everything was smooth until the Tea Party came along, that's just a lie.
Actually, Bob, I have to ask you about that. Bob, I have to ask you about that because you often do take a tertiary measure and use it to supplant the primary one already provided to us by the actual dispute in question. Let's look. Isn't there something wanting in the intellectual genuineness of this president? Isn't he, in short, somewhat perfidious in his assertions? Here's a man who stood up. Here's a man who did stand up and chastise Bush for having the temerity to ask for the debt ceiling to be raised, and then he himself completely forgets his own past and chastises those who would dare to do the very thing he did himself, Bob Weiner.
Nobody's ever postured before, and when they have to govern, change.
Bob, did the president commit the very thing he criticized later? Did he himself, when Bush is in power, decide to vote against raising the debt ceiling, and by default, hasn't he exposed his own hypocrisy when looking back on his history?
The liberals sometimes did that if they didn't like the amount that the ceiling was raised, if they didn't like the fact that enough programs weren't being supported. And it's a different ballgame to be a liberal senator than the governing president.
So it was all right when he did it, but it's not okay when his former colleagues do it to him.
It's one of those votes that you throw out, but if you really needed a vote to run the country, you'd vote differently.